Kicking off what I repeatedly misread as Furry's big week, Iron Man 2: The Legacy continues the Iron Man trilogy with a story that is probably the basis of Vision's entire strength incites challenge, challenge incites conflict, and conflict breeds catastrophe concept. Hey, I'm Chris, and I'm reviewing every entry, which is what I'm going to say from now on, every entry in the MCU, and today we're looking at Iron Man 2. Everyone's back. Mostly.
Look, it's me. I'm here. Deal with it. Let's move on.
We do have some stuff to unpack there, along with the super rushed Demon in the Bottle plotline and tons of daddy issues to go around.
My father.
Your dad.
Daddy.
My father.
Your dad, huh? My dad. Father.
Thanks, Dad.
Let's jump right in with where the film picks up. The city that is always snowing in Hollywood movies, Moscow. In a dank upper room, rundown apartment, a sickly old man watches Iron Man's outing speech and begins to call out for his son, Ivan, who's off in timeout, I guess. Ivan, played by Mickey Rourke, who was 57 years old in real life when this was filmed, by the way. Well, before seeing his father succumb to his illness, Anton tells his son that he should be getting the glory on Russian news instead of Tony Stark. Now, we don't know much about Ivan's past here, but it's clear that seeing his father pass away does seem to light a fire under him, and we get a sequence very reminiscent of the cave sequence in Iron Man 1, which, the yin-yang thing from the first film, is in full effect, and Favreau is really leaning into it during the sequel. Many scenes are just mirroring the previous one. Interlaced opening credits alongside newspaper exposition add some depth for the characters since the sequel, demonstrating time passing, and we also get a little bit of depth for Ivan. I read that Rourke insisted that his character needed a bird, as it would humanize him. Not 100% on that, but I may have my own bias against bird owners. There's an article on this wall discussing Stark's activity and how it might be impacting government contracts, assuming that this is probably setting the stage for why the US government isn't happy about Iron Man's efficiency later in the film. There's also a headline about Iron Man stabilizing East-West relations, but I think everyone might be more interested in the How Pepper Pot Keeps Her Figure article. All of this does beg the question of if a superpowered individual did suddenly pop up in our very real world, how would the geopolitical power shift? Who knows, but it's an interesting question that Iron Man 2 seeks to explore. And dropping what I'm assuming is vodka on his very own arc reactor, Vanko's creation comes to life. Hard cut 6 months later, and I don't know if that's like 6 months from this,
I am Iron Man.
or 6 months from the last shot with Vanko, but either way, time has passed, and we cut to Tony on a plane. Again, this is great writing all around. At first glance, it seems that Tony is diving into action. Being flown up to high altitude, he begins his dive through a barrage of what we find out is fireworks, all to AC/DC's Shoot to Thrill, which has all of the energy for the sequence, but the lyrics do support Tony's current state of mind. In 10 seconds with Tony, we're able to bridge the gap between Iron Man 1's speech and current events. That while doing good in the world, Tony is a bit reckless, entitled, and the fact that he's being carried via plane when he can fly would suggest that he's trying to cut back on using the suit as much as possible. We're going to get into that more in a minute. Making a hard landing on what has to be a vibranium floor, Tone's center stage, and the Ironettes are backing him up. And I'm told these are members of the LA Chargers cheerleading squad. Insert Chargers joke here. Tony is serving as his own hype guy, and that role was previously Rhodey's. After about 2 solid minutes of talking about how awesome he is, and how no one is man enough to go toe-to-toe with him on his best day, which, like, does that even make sense? Maybe I'm too literal, but it just always feels like that line bugs me. Like, it would be a cockier thing to say, no one's man enough to go toe-to-toe with me while I have the flu. At any rate, Tony hard shifts into introducing the main theme of the story and the movie.
It's not about me. It's not about you. It's not even about us. It's about legacy.
Tony's kicked off the Stark Expo, which he says he'll have his father explain. But if you listen to what Howard says here in the finely graded 1970s tape, it's actually just more fluff. And the film never really explains what the expo is. If you recall, we do get a glimpse of this Stark Expo and what it was like back in the 40s in Captain America, complete with an enlistment amusement ride. According to the guidebook for that film, the original expo was Stark's way to capitalize on the World's Fair that was being canceled due to the war. So really, the Stark Expo is kind of a play on old world fairs, TED Talks, and some Walt Disney mixed in there for good measure. Which This was written and filmed several months before the Disney acquisition, so those correlations to Walt Disney are not self-referential, and not that that's important, it's just this is the last time I think we see Stark Sr. likened to Walt Disney, from the best I can remember. They say that the expo is going to be going on all year, dedicated to learning, tackling the problems of today and tomorrow, and leave a better world for our kids. Remember that, it's important. But as Tony goes backstage to check his blood toxicity level, we see that there's more going on than what meets the eye. Leaving the expo, Stark is accosted by a gaggle of highly influential people just dying to meet him. Like the CEO of Oracle, a huge real-life technology firm, which is an uncomfortable level of product placement. He does ride the elevator with Seth Green, which is weird. He passes by the Watcher's informant, and he's served a subpoena by a multiversal version of Sue Storm, which leads him to appear before Congress the following day. Hard cut to DC in the middle of Stark's deposition. The committee to confront Iron Man is led by one Senator Stern, and they are pretty eager to get their hands on Tony's tech. I wonder why. So who knows if the Hydra stuff was 100% planned at this phase in the MCU, as it would be about 4 years before we find out that Gary Shandling was playing a Hydra plant, but it really works in the scene either way. The government, for nefarious reasons or not, wants a private citizen's technology in order to weaponize it for themselves, and Stark's having none of it and getting a rise from Stern along the way. Again, it creates an interesting legal and ethical and moral dilemma, which we see played out in the film as you look at how Tony handles this stuff versus how Rhodey handles this stuff. Right, so real quick, let's deal with this recast. So we have now like 10 years worth of commentary by everyone doing all of these different interviews, and there seems to be some discrepancies over what happened, and Marvel's kind of quiet about the whole thing. But Terrence Howard was very excited to be on board for Iron Man 1, as he was one of the first actors even cast for that film. He claims that he personally vouched for his friend, Robert Downey Jr., to get the role of Iron Man. After the wild success of the first film, Marvel knew that they had the face of the franchise, and it's not War Machine. So in spite of having 3-film contract with Terrence, he claims that they came back to pay him only a fraction of what was originally contracted, which, hindsight being what it is, with the success of the entire MCU franchise, that is a really tough break for Howard. Having said that, I do love Don Cheadle, and I was very jazzed that he was going to be in this movie. I've loved him ever since I seen Volcano as a kid. Rhodes shows up to the deposition to provide testimony from the US military's R&D perspective regarding Tony's tech. We're introduced to Justin Hammer also, who's played by Sam Rockwell, who, look, do yourself a favor and watch you some Sam Rockwell stuff. He is the best. He's extremely whiny and unbearable in this flick as a business antagonist to Tony. And I get it if you're not on the Rockwell train because of this, but the dude is talented. Just saying. Hammer Industries is a parallel to Stark Industries, and Hammer in the comics, as well as in the MCU, is really just a standard business bad guy. And I did get a kick out of reading that his powers and ability include a middle-aged man with a business degree. America. So back to the deposition, which has now turned into a full circus, as these high-profile depositions often do. If anyone wants to see what a real true-to-life deposition is, they're so much more boring. But if you want to see a tech guy having a hard time explaining things to a bunch of 60-year-old politicians and how crazy it can just get, go watch Mark Zuckerberg's thing. I'm sure there's some channels that have done some highlights out there. It's at least a solid hour of entertainment for you. As Hammer's starting out his scare tactic presentation, though, about how everyone is attempting to create their own Iron Man weapon, Tony makes the claim that no one is even remotely close to his technology, and that it would take about 20 years for anyone to catch up. And at Tony's innovation rate, he would definitely be ahead of them. If we're paying attention at home, this is where his stance was in Iron Man 1 about arms races.
I prefer the weapon you only have to fire once.
And here's where we're at now.
I'm your nuclear deterrent.
It'll be interesting to see where this arc goes over the next few years. Oh, and speaking of what the future holds, there is a little Easter egg here on Tony's phone device thing, suggesting that he may be a part of this timeline's Illuminati. And I'm thinking that might have just been a funny little shortcut he added for the device, or something that Favreau just thought would be a clever nod to his comic counterpart. For now, he's satisfied with just embarrassing Hammer on the world stage, deservedly so, and then he pieces out saying that he's successfully privatized world peace, which again is a great statement that asks some interesting questions of us, but we're going to get into that later. As Tony's talking about pleasuring himself on national television, we cut away to see Ivan watching the footage on a very rustic Russian television, and we see the pleasure wash over him as he lights up his whips at his workstation for the first time. Back at Stark's workstation, Jarvis quips about Tony having a video finally with his clothes on, which is a weird detail I feel like the MCU has forgotten about. But even just saying that Jarvis quipped is quite the statement. I didn't get much into this during the Iron Man field guide, but digital AI assistant is a fascinating concept to show how advanced Tony really is. Jarvis's comic counterpart was very much flesh and blood human, and I guess the MCU did fit that into continuity with Agent Carter, but the AI evolves from film to film. In the first movie, he's more of a house assistant bot who understands colloquial language and has a slight sense of humor.
What was I thinking? You're usually so discreet.
It's also played by Paul Bettany, who I have loved since A Night Tale, and that's why I called my AI Joffrey. Fun fact. But in Iron Man 2, he's so much more. He's able to contemplate, understand complicated commands, along with comprehending the urgency behind them. And probably the biggest brain move, he's able to grasp what Tony's trying to accomplish later in the film with the new element sequence, and sticks lockstep with him throughout the entire thing in this unspoken connection the two have. It's science fiction for sure, but it's something that's always fascinated me. Jarvis's evolution is definitely one of the highlights of these films for me. For now, the two discuss how the palladium is what is killing him, hence the toxicity checks we've been seeing throughout the movie so far. Which, interestingly, if you didn't know, which I didn't know and I don't know why anybody would, palladium is not toxic by itself, but its compounds are considered highly so, and regarded as even carcinogenic. More you know. And while the film just yada yadas over what's really happening here, veins don't look like this, and it really gives me the vibe that something else is happening here under the surface with Tony. And maybe I'm crazy, it definitely gives me the vibe that is associated with that old school celestial art stuff with the zigzagging lines and right angles. And someone tell me in the comments what I'm thinking of. I'm sure there's something to Google there, but that's the best description I have. While being lectured by Jarvis that his time is limited and that the suit is expediting that demise, Tony's interrupted by Pepper Potts, who is overall not super happy with Tony's work performance as of late. Being a superhero attempting world peace and a CEO creating a legacy of exploration and learning for future generations, along with this toxic blood and sometimes toxic behavior from time to time, surely has got him stretched pretty thin. Tony recently gave the order to donate off all of their modern art collection to the Boy Scouts, I think it said, except one piece that likens him to Obama, which is kind of interesting based on what he says while he's hanging that poster up.
I don't care about the liberal agenda anymore. It's boring. Boring. I'm giving you a boring alert.
But I do think this is intended to show that people are rallied behind Tony as an agent of change and hope in the world, and that his agenda is far bigger and more important than the petty squabbles of politicians. But in the process of arguing with Pepper, he says that the expo is essential to his plans, as he was donating off the modern art collection as a tax write-off. She tells Tony that the expo is just his ego booster, and that's probably more going on than what meets the eye. And to expand on how Tony's been planning things behind the scenes, he does offer Pepper Potts the job of CEO for Stark Industries. And while the two drink champagne together, we cut over to Ivan, who's prepping to leave the country under a false passport. And speaking of falsified documentation, we are next introduced to Natalie Rushman, ready to make Pepper's new role official. Tony's immediately smitten with her, and from what I can only assume is intended to build some intrigue with the character, Tony has Natalie come up and box with Happy for some reason. Not that he's complaining. And while he's chatting over the documentation with Pepper and his desire to hire Natalie as a replacement assistant for her, she reminds him that sexual harassment lawsuits are a thing, which is very interesting, just saying that this guy directed the film.
And she is potentially a very expensive sexual harassment lawsuit.
I want one.
No.
Extremely hard cut over to Monaco for some reason for a Grand Prix race party. We quickly find out that Tony did hire Natalie as a personal assistant, and as Tony's rubbing elbows with the who's who in the Illuminati Club, Justin Hammer is just down the bar a little bit, and he takes this opportunity to schmooze it up with Tony, and we see the reporter from the first movie, who's really only included here, it seems, to somehow rub it in Justin's face that he's only pursuing Tony's industry and past flings, as a vulture would cling to scraps left behind by a lion. but the Vanity Fair reporter probably has her own angles. Doesn't really matter. She never shows back up again in the movie. Tony excuses himself to check on his toxicity level, and he decides that recklessness is a good way to go and relieves the Grand Prix driver on the spot to race this extremely fast car himself. Things are going fine until Vanko makes an appearance on the track, cracking his crackle whips. And he demonstrates not only the effectiveness of his tech, but also the insane speed at which he can move, as these cars can go up to 200 miles an hour, and he's just like, WHAPAAA! Should also note that there's a little bit of yin-yang thing happening here, as Whiplash's Mark I suit and reactor are vaguely familiar to Tony's. I guess not everyone is 20 years away, as Tony suspected. We get a clearer picture as to why and how Whiplash has this tech later. I don't think we ever call him Whiplash, by the way. It's just this comic thing. I didn't know this, but comic nerds specifically, do not like this movie because of what it does to Whiplash, but it's all lost on me. As a two cat and mouse for a bit, it's clear that winning is only a matter of perspective here. If he can tumble Tony from his high hill, then he's met his agenda. Everything else is just icing on the cake. Happy and Pepper make their way to Tony, saving him at the last minute, and then they hand Tony the football suitcase, and we get an epic sequence. But Ivan isn't so easy to take down, even for a fully suited up Iron Man. Vanko does force Tony to go toe-to-toe with him. Investigating the arc reactor that shouldn't exist, Tony crushes it and dips out as Ivan raves like a madman. At the prison, Tony stops by for a quick chat, presumably to see, where he got this tech from. And Vanko says, the F word. Father. That's pretty much all he needs to know, but Ivan does let Tony know that he knows that the palladium is having its side effects. On the plane ride home, Hydra Senator's already politicizing this in a press release, and Tony asks Pepper just to go away with him for a little bit, in what is really a kind of touching sequence. But she's way too busy, there's too much stuff happening, and she's not having any of it. And then she says this line.
Not everybody runs on batteries, Tony.
And right, just so we're clear, Tony doesn't run on batteries. The Iron Man suit does, but okay, we're gonna get into that later. We get a sequence then in which Justin really likes what he just saw Vanko do and decides to break Ivan out of jail so that Hammer can have him whip up some new tech using Vanko's arc reactor designs.
I want my board.
Researching and overall not looking too hot, Tony's visited by Rhodey, and Stark lets him in on his secret that's just killing him, to which Rhodey suggests that Tony doesn't have to always do the solo act. Foreshadowing. Meanwhile, Vanko and Hammer's duet is underway as Whiplash is at the Hammer facility in Queens now. Maybe heeding Rhodes' words the wrong way, Tony seems to be trying out a duet of his own with Natalie. And I'll say I don't quite understand her motives in this sequence, which Tony even says he can't get a read on her, but if she was sent by S.H.I.E.L.D., as we find out later she was, just to keep an eye on Stark, why in the world does she set him up for this good old-fashioned self-destruction? I guess she wasn't quite thinking he'd go off the deep end for a real quick demon in the bottle plotline. Maybe instead he would just open up to her and make her part of the inner circle. I don't know. Anyway, Tony is throwing a big old party for his birthday, has too much to drink, and becomes belligerent. As Pepper tries to end the night, Party Tony revs it up more and more.
Goldstein,
Yes, Mr. Stark.
give me a fat beat to beat my buddy's ass.
And if you didn't know this, which I didn't until I was researching for this film is dedicated to this young man, as DJ AM, which I believe is how you would say that, would actually pass away a few weeks or months after this was filmed. And it was from a drug overdose after a decade or so of being sober. Favreau said that he was thrilled to have Adam on the set and that they had a lot of internal deliberations on how to handle this footage, but they ultimately decided to dedicate the film to him and keep it going as a homage to him. Back to the party, which is now getting out of control, Rhodes shows up and decides War Machine will have to shut it down. The two brawl it out in Toner's Malibu homestead, and while doing so, Pepper lets out that she knows that something's not adding up with Natalie's presence, and rightfully so. Check out her reflexes when the Iron Men crash through the place. The two cross repulsor beams,
Don't cross the streams.
basically destroying the main floor of Tony's bachelor pad. Rhodes takes War Machine armor to the US military installation and hands it over to Hammer, which, if you watch Rhodes' arc through Iron Man 1 to the endgame, it's a fantastic line of progression for the character. Back in LA, Tony is visited by Agent Coulson and Nick Fury, and it's revealed that Natalie is spoiler, Natasha, and was sent by S.H.I.E.L.D. to keep an eye on Tony, as his behavior has been erratic, self-destructive, but it's also showing a pattern of continuity of work in a post-Tony world.
It's about legacy.
They give him a toxicity tonic and tell him to get to work on this box of random crap from his father that I guess has just been sitting at S.H.I.E.L.D. for some reason, revealing that Stark Sr. was a founding member of S.H.I.E.L.D. So while Tony begins to humanize his father, Justin's attempt to trick Ivan into believing that his bird is a bird, again, humanizing, but also don't really understand why bird ownership is humanizing somebody, but he knows it's not his bird. But like, where is his bird? Like, is there it's like a bird daycare he dropped it off at in Russia, or is like a friend have it, or is it still sitting in his apartment? Just like, maybe he could just be like, where's the bird, Ivan? Anyway, the two riff back and forth about Ivan turning Hammer's suits into drones, and Hammer leaves to go meet up with Rhodes to talk about weaponizing the war machine, which I hate to go in these little threads, but I'm not 100% sure what's happening here. I believe the idea is they're going to give the suit to Hammer, and he's going to figure out how to reverse engineer it to build it back better. But why? Like, I don't understand. It's already solid. Maybe just reverse engineer it. I don't know. Back at the ranch, we see Tony looking through old schematics and watching the old Walt Disney-esque footage of his father doing that expo footage that we saw earlier in the film. Out of the blue, Howard Stark starts to address Tony, saying that he needs him to figure something out, and that he was limited by the technology of his time, and confides that his son was his greatest creation. Stark immediately dips out and just goes to talk with Pepper for a bit, presumably all up in his feels, processing his daddy issues, and he wants to make things right with her before maybe that sickness consumes him. Failing to think clearly, be it the toxicity in his blood or maybe he's just kind of aloof, he offers Pepper the only food that she would be allergic to, and she dips out. Tony, on his way out, sees the board from the Stark Expo that he just saw in the video moments ago. In fairness, it probably was something that he had set out to work on the Stark Expo preparations. Taking the board home, we get a fantastic sequence in which Tony realizes that his dad designed an entire Stark Expo grounds as a model of a conceptual new element.
Am I to include the Belgian waffle stands?
Yes, by the way, you always keep the waffles in your life. Frightfully easy, Tony figures out the puzzle and gets right to work synthesizing this new element, which, by the way, there's been something like 13 or 14 new elements discovered since the 70s, which is kind of cool stuff that I don't understand. But Coulson stops by to tease up the Thor movie and hands Tony a prop to tease up that Captain America movie, and Tony gets right to work, laser beaming the room apart. Well, I have no idea what's actually happening here science-wise in this sequence. I think that we should make all wires out of whatever material these ones are, considering everything else got cut and they didn't. The new element is a suitable safe replacement for palladium that is killing Tony, and it's pretty neat peak after a low point in Act 2. And they also tease up future MCU connections as well.
Everything from projects Pegasus, Exodus, and Goliath.
Kicking off Act 3 with a bird napping, Hammer goes full tough guy on Ivan. The understated beauty of that line is that Ivan told Hammer that he talks too much, to which Justin just keeps talking, and it's fantastic. After he leaves, in about 3 seconds, I assume, he offs those guards and he calls Tony Stark. Tony has Jarvis trace a call, and Jarvis capitalizes on that sweet, sweet product placement again.
Accessing the Oracle grid.
Iron Man 2 brought to you by Oracle. I have vivid memories, by the way, of Oracle posters in my tech office that were touting Oracle's cloud products using Iron Man 2 in the imagery. Just gonna say that we live in the darkest timeline in which these two companies were, I don't know what's happening here. Like, it's so weird that Iron Man would be like, go use this Oracle technology. It's Oracle. I mean, it's good. It's enterprise grade database stuff. And then we get the most problematic sequence in this entire film, in which Tony shoves the new element powered arc reactor into him untested. That is what it is. Go big or go home. I get that. But again, Tony isn't a robot, so this generator is here to power the magnet that is keeping the shrapnel away from his heart. So why would putting this generator in him have any biological side effect at all? He's like, I have power now. Don't get it. That is a serious question, by the way. It just seems like so many small things in this film are so well thought out that I just don't understand this plot point. It feels like somewhere along the way in these movies, the analogy of Tony's heart actually somehow began to take over the actual lore that established just why he's got this thing in his chest in the first place. And it just feels jarring.
You can solve the riddle of your heart.
But I'm all for a new powered up Tony and the hope for a new day. As Justin somehow is bringing just a little less energy than Steve Ballmer to the stage, he begins a spiel of introducing an Iron Legion of his own for each branch of the military. Sans Coast Guard and National Guard, they don't matter. And, well, I guess Space Force if this were made today, as well as War Machine is then introduced into the center stage. Tony comes swooping in to shut the whole thing down, and as all hell begins to break loose, as Ivan takes full remote control of the drones and Rhodes' armor. With the chase sequence beginning, people start making their way out of the park. Tony manages to evade all of the shots being fired from the squadron, including remote-controlled Rhodey behind him. As Jarvis begins to attempt a reboot of the War Machine OS, we quickly find out that he's being locked out. Iron Manning isn't easy though, as he's still trying to save the lives of all of these people fleeing, except one brave and kind of dumb kid who stands solo against the drone completely unarmed, only to get protected by the real Iron Man moments before he's obliterated. Having Hammer arrested in the aftermath of the bots going rogue, the Scooby Squad come to realize that they can't shut down the drones or Rhodey remotely, so Black Widow and Happy have to break into Hammer's facility in Queens to take down Vanko and shut down the drone connections. After this enjoyable fight sequence that just full of beating up security guards who are just doing their job, presumably, the duo find out that Whiplash has vacated the building, but they are still able to pull the plug on Rhodey the robot. Ending up in a gully, probably near the sweet, delicious smell of griddled Belgian waffles, Iron Man and War Machine hold off the rest of the drones together. We get to see a new addition to Stark's weaponry. Whiplash drops in with a new and improved suit and weapons and gives Iron Duo a run for their money. Rhodes decides to try out one of Hammer's top-selling items, and it predictably goes poorly. It's a funny little sequence. And then they have some fantastic framing, showing the differences between these two heroes, separated by their ideologies, and also by a literal crazy 57-year-old man. We're taken back to the sequence in which they were previously in the standoff in Tony's house, and we see that once again, Vanko is all talk and really doesn't have the tech to go toe-to-toe with Tony. Once beaten though, Vanko goes full Predator mode, because winning was never the mission. Knocking Tony down a peg or two was all that he desired. Explosion, 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 Oracle, explosion, explosion. Tony swoops in to save Pepper at the last moment, and the two share their first romantic moment on a rooftop being spied on by Rhodey, who's sitting like 6 feet away from them. Rhodes decides to keep the War Machine suit for himself, and we cut back to Tony back at the S.H.I.E.L.D. headquarters, surrounded by Easter eggs that we'd all nerd out over for the next 12 years. Fury lets Tony know that the Iron Man would be an asset to the team. Stark, not so much. They offer him to keep him on as a consultant, and that comes up in that one shot I explained during the Hulk field guide. Of course, the screens have a ton of stuff going on. The Incredible Hulk footage is on screen, suggesting that these are current events and not something that happened 2 years prior. But the map is also full of some fun stuff to look at, with circles suggesting that S.H.I.E.L.D. is watching Wakanda. Perhaps they found Cap's ship up here, a blip down in Malibu, which is probably Tony, the New Mexico incident, the Hulk incident, and something here in the Atlantic Ocean, could be Atlantis maybe, and then somewhere over here in nondescript Europe, maybe it's Sokovia, maybe it's a Dr. Doom reference that hasn't come to fruition yet. The film concludes with Tony getting the Senator to publicly kiss up to him, and our stinger alludes to the events of Coulson's journey in New Mexico, which teases up Thor's hammer and also Dutch angles. Basically, it's like the entire movie is filmed with. But let's talk about those daddy issues and legacies in the deeper meaning.
We got trouble.
Considering, as far as we know, we are the only animal on this planet that can face our own mortality. Because we can comprehend our own demise, we have evolved over the course of our time on this rock to learn various ways to cope with it, some better than others. The subplot running throughout Iron Man 2 is Tony facing his own mortality due to the toxicity of the thing that's keeping him alive. Remove the device, he dies. Keep the device in and sit on the couch doing nothing, he dies. Use the Iron Man suit to keep do-gooding in the world, he dies. The space between a rock and a hard place that Tony has found himself in is a no-win situation. In the background, we see almost all of the events of the film have come to fruition though, because Tony is facing his death. Off-screen, between films, he was super busy securing world peace and helping foster a new age of diplomacy around the world. Once his super heroics are no longer needed on the forefront of everyone's mind, he shifts to the Stark Expo, which is pointing his company towards the benefit of all mankind, which is a night and day difference between the literal warmongering of the past. I'm assuming that Tony's donating the entire modern art collection to the Boy Scouts of America for that tax break was probably an effort to shift funds around for something that we don't really get an on-screen explanation for, but it does imply that there's a lot of moving pieces to his plan. Naming Pepper Potts as the CEO ensures a continuity of work in case of his untimely demise, but it puts the company in the hands of someone that Tony trusts implicitly, both morally and business-wise. Tony's self-destructive behavior only really begins when all of those pieces are in play. The racetrack specifically probably represents an ideal way that Tony would like to leave this world. But that was halted when Vanko shows up on the track, confirming to Tony that while his futuring and planning was spot on, there are always elements of the unknown ahead, which is literally manifested in the film when Tony creates an unknown element. So now he also has to add in a continuity of Iron Manning with the only person that he may trust to handle that technology implicitly. So Tony's demon in the bottle tussle was all just a way to perpetuate the Iron Man without Tony Stark. Vanko sees things a lot like Tony as well. To him, he's living for the moment, one single act to make Tony bleed, which is less about Tony and more about his daddy, which invokes that yin-yang thing from this film. Neither of these guys chose their legacy. It was given to them. Perception of it and the reality of it. Both of these men's perception of their legacy are complex, with both good and bad mixed together, and their worldviews are determined by their perceptions of those legacies. Stark grew up distant from his father, who was busy attempting to change the world, both publicly and privately. The problem is that Tony's perspective is limited to what his view of his legacy really was. Seeing his father as a cold man who was too busy making money to pay attention to him probably instilled in Tony a desire to achieve high enough to warrant his father's attention. It's also possible that Howard named Tony after the guy he had deported to Siberia. Then keeping in mind that the money being made that kept Tony's father away from him was profiting off the military-industrial complex, and that was sure to skew Tony's perspective of everything in a post-cave life. Vanko, on the other hand, certainly grew up hearing stories of his father's genius and the exploits in America until the evil Howard Stark betrayed him and had him sent off to Siberia as punishment. A punishment that wouldn't fit the crime at the hands of a billionaire, keeping the little guy down and out. This would have undoubtedly led to Ivan experiencing a harsh life with little means other than just the genius he inherited from his father. And from physical fathers to forefathers, I think this is where the film comments on War Machine and the congressional hearings plotline. We, the people, did not get to choose the nations we were born into, which are full of even more complex mishmash of good, bad, and ugly than Stark and Vanko had combined. So Iron Man 1, the message is really simple and clear. What are you going to do with what you've been given? Iron Man 2, it's what are you going to do in spite of what you've been given? Are you going to live it out, or are you going to rise above it? Legacies, be it national, family, or whatever, they're not built on good intentions. They're built on what you actually do. Tony's goal is to build a better world than what he inherited, and thus leave a legacy that could be followed. And in maybe the MCU's best retcon of all time, this kid is confirmed to be none other than Peter Parker, aka Spider-Man himself, which definitely leans into this idea of our legacy and what we leave behind. But we're going to get more into that way down the line in the MCU field guides, so stick with me there. But that's all I have to say about Iron Man 2. Let me know your thoughts in the comments and join me next time as we talk about Thor with all those Dutch angles. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.